everyone, and welcome to the KUL podcast, Rethinking Heat in the City. This is the first of a series of podcasts where we look at climate change through the lens of social, economic, and gendered inequalities, using Karachi as a backdrop. I am Akhtas Fatma, an anthropologist and research associate at Karachi Urban Lab, and I will be your host today. The Karachi Urban Lab was set up in 2016 in a context where data production on the urban in Pakistan remains top-down and largely technocratic. Over the last few years, we have been investigating and understanding the complex challenges of urban planning, affordable housing, infrastructural development, and climate change. Our current project, Cool Infrastructures Life with Heat in the Off-Grid City, is focused on 4 global cities that are critical for understanding the future of life with heat: Karachi, Pakistan; Jakarta, Indonesia; Hyderabad, India; and Yaoundé, Cameroon. This project is funded by GCRF. Our research project aims to enhance our understanding of social and technical infrastructures for cooling and the intersections of heat, climate, and bodies. For our first episode, we welcome our colleague from the project, Dr. Elspeth Oppermann. Dr. Oppermann is a critical geographer specializing in adaptation to environmental challenges. Her past research examined discourses of climate change adaptation in the United Kingdom and the social practices through which outdoor workers manage extreme heat in Australia. She is a member of the International Commissions of Occupational Health Scientific Committee on Thermal Factors and continues to engage in heat health research, particularly for those most exposed. As a senior research fellow at the Rachel Carson Centre, Elspeth is co-investigator on Cool Infrastructures. Welcome, Elspeth, to the podcast, and thank you for being the first guest on the show. Right. So what I really just wanted to start with is to ask what got you interested in heat and what made you think that heat was something that was worth being spoken about, particularly in this realm of climate change and global environmental disasters. Why is heat something so necessary to focus on?
Well, my reason for getting involved is actually quite personal in that I grew up in a small city in northern Australia called Darwin, which is kind of Australia's little tropical enclave, and it's very known domestically for being an incredibly hot place. Essentially, nobody wants to go there, nobody wants to live there, nobody wants to work there because it's so hot. And so growing up in those conditions and working in those conditions, I was sort of very aware of how unique it was trying to cope with heat in your day-to-day life. So that was a big driver for me. And in the context of climate change, actually, the reason why I became interested in heat was because in the Australian political context, for the last 10 years, you're not really allowed to talk about climate change very openly. We have a rather climate denialist government. And so talking about the sort of on-the-ground impacts of climate change rather than climate change per se was the only way to kind of engage with the problem.
That's actually really interesting. But I wonder then, growing up in heat or being so accustomed to it, at what point does it become a concern or something that you think needs a solution rather than something that you just manage?
So, I mean, one of the issues that arises in that context where you're seasonally or year-round exposed to heat is that there's often this discourse that people are adapted to it, people are used to it, it doesn't cause a problem. I'm sure you're familiar with that also in the sort of South Asian context as well. And yet what you see is a very widespread tolerance of the sort of smaller impacts on a day-to-day basis. So people may not die from heat waves as frequently, but you do see a lot of symptoms where, for example, people who work outside a lot are exposed with and experience sort of lower levels of heat illness. So whether that's a headache every day when they come home from work, whether that's sort of fatigue, not being able to engage with their families or their children when they come home because they just have to sleep and recover, or people sort of regularly feeling nauseous as a result of heat exposure. And these things becoming, at least in the Australian context, normalized or even kind of valorized as the people who really go out there and are tough in a tough environment.
I think we definitely do see a reflection of that in our context as well. where oftentimes, even when we go into field to talk about perceptions and experiences of heat, we're met with a lot of responses along the lines of, Garmi to hoti hai, why are you talking about Garmi? Meaning heat will always be there. It isn't really a matter we get much choice in, so there isn't really any use talking about it. But also responses that suggest that there are bigger troubles to be concerned about, both in terms of health and the environment. And essentially, heat is understood as a given that doesn't really require much specific attention because there is little that can be done about it. And I think that is what makes it such an invisible threat, because people only really become concerned once there are heat wave alerts, especially recently with the North American heat waves. The concern really emerged after the issue became global and relevant. And it's very evident that these alienated experiences of heat are very differently understood and treated, especially in terms of their threat. Prolonged stressors that people exist with routinely are largely absent from the conversation and have remained so. I do wonder if you have any suggestions or thoughts on how these concerns can be overcome.
I think that's a really good point. So one of the things that coming out of this context where people are seasonally exposed or year-round exposed in the global tropics, one of the things I think we all have to argue for and push the case for is that extreme heat, or the hazards and dangers of heat, are not just heat waves. So I prefer to use the term extreme heat as a kind of umbrella term, within which heat waves is these sort of short, acute periods of exceptional shifts in temperature, or temperature and humidity occur. Those are just one subsection or subgroup. But extreme heat also unfolds seasonally and year-round, as I mentioned. And what we're starting to see with climate change is a third category of these sort of slow onset, gradual step changes in the climatic zone itself. So in the sort of general environmental conditions, as a third sort of longer temporal scale type of extreme heat. So I think using the phrase extreme heat is really important because it means that we don't lose sight of the people who struggle with this on a daily basis, rather than for a week in summer, as you might find in more temperate zones.
Are there ways of posing interventions or solutions based on these three different categorizations of heat? Or how do we talk about the nuances or the differences between these different categories in order to implement planning and implement policies that are suitable to each in their own way?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, if we think of them as sort of nested at temporal scales, you have like the heat wave that might occur for a few days to a week, 10 days or so. Then the seasonal folding out to sort of months, perhaps 6 months of the year, or and then these step changes where just average temperatures are creeping up across every day of the year across the year. And so because of that kind of temporal nesting, what that also means is that policy responses can also be nested in a similar way. So if we think about the sort of short period of the heat wave, you might only have an emergency response, which plays out for a few days, where you put on, for example, extra medical staff, or you make sure that there's extra water available, or perhaps you reduce the cost or annul the cost of power for a short period of time to ensure that people can afford to cool their home themselves or hydrate themselves in order to protect themselves against heat. But obviously that's not feasible, or at least financially it's incredibly expensive if you were to do that across the entire season or across the entire year. So it makes sense then, when you're looking at seasonal exposures, to take much more sort of structural institutional steps that are embedded in the day-to-day lives of people. So ensuring that people have regular access to power, ensuring that people have shelter, or that their homes are not putting them at further risk of heat because they actually have good insulative properties, rather than trapping heat and exposing people further. So the methods for each of these three categories of responding are different, but they can complement each other. At the step change level, I think that's probably one of the areas where globally we're only starting to come to grips with. This is where there are projections, for example, that places like a lot of the Gulf states may become inhospitable to human life by 2050, towards the end of the century. just because the sort of temperatures, even at nighttime, will be so extreme that it will be really impossible to live without living in a completely air-conditioned, sheltered environment 24/7, 365 days of the year. So when you get to that point, there are obviously major systemic civilizational changes that need to be made in order to cope, whether that's migrating to somewhere else, whether that's radically changing just every aspect of life in terms of how we live, whether we live in an entirely encapsulated life, are sort of bigger questions that need to be grappled with. But for most people in most parts of the world, these smaller temporal scales of weeks to months are the ones that we need to deal with.
I do think that what you said is completely valid, but I think that one thing, again, that complicates it even further, or that is a very necessary concern to address beyond that, is that of vulnerability. And that even within these domains of identifying heat as a concern, there's also on the reception end a lot of differences in who is more susceptible to what kind of heat and to what degree within that kind. So within that, how do policymakers or how do researchers even engage with those vulnerabilities and understand differential impacts of heat?
That's a big question. So you're absolutely right to point out vulnerability. So I think historically we've focused a lot on just projecting the hazard, seeing how bad it will be, where it will happen. But vulnerability and exposure are absolutely enormous factors to consider in looking at our heat risk and therefore how we respond. So if we take vulnerability first, you're absolutely right to point out that this is a massive issue. So vulnerability, if we would say, is your ability to cope with the hazard when it actually occurs, and that in the context of heat, that can take a number of different avenues. So one of the ones that we might look at would be shelter, the quality of housing that people have access to, and the reason for this is that a lot of the sort of principles of how you respond to a heat wave or an extreme event would be to say, take shelter, stay at home, seek cover, which in many contexts of Western world actually doesn't protect you. It actually puts you at further risk. So it's really critical for policymakers that if they are making that advice, that they ensure that the quality of shelter is sufficient, that it has good thermal insulation, or that it allows for good cross-ventilation or flow of air, so that it's not actually trapping heat and basically trapping people in a convection oven. Another issue of vulnerability is ensuring that people have access to the utilities that they need to cool their bodies and their homes. So that might be electricity is perhaps the most obvious one, ensuring that there's a regular supply of electricity and that people can actually afford to use it. The other issue is of course water, and water is perhaps the most fundamental means that we have to cool ourselves, in the sense that everybody needs to be able to access sufficient drinking water to remain hydrated as possible. Because the body's thermal regulation system, its ability to sweat, relies on having adequate access to clean drinking water. And in so many contexts, that just isn't available. There are other issues related to that where, for example, if accessing water or if using going to the toilet essentially is a dangerous activity, then what is actually being reported is that women are avoiding remaining hydrated because they are afraid to go out and use public facilities, basically to relieve themselves. So this is a really fundamental physiological need that is taken for granted in so many contexts, and yet for tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands or more women, it's actually not available. So it's really critical to make sure these sort of fundamental needs are met.
Absolutely. And in essence, I think that is what we are discussing here. The solutions to spaces heating up and health impacts of heat are not inherently straightforward and actually require a lot of opening up of how complex these issues actually are, both in the broader sense of disasters, but also in being sensitive to their cultural and social overlaps. And I think it is also important to talk about how negligence of such impacts that can be perceived as mundane threatens not only comfortable living, but even survivability in the most extremes of scenarios.
I think that's a really important point. And I mean, one of the interesting things about heat is that it's complicated, but it's not impossible. So it's complicated in the sense that there's a lot of interactions, a lot of small considerations that need to be brought to bear. But actually, it's not technically challenging in the way that, for example, flood defenses might be technically challenging at a sort of, in terms of civil engineering or something like that. There's so many. Really, the issue about heat is that there's lots of small incremental changes that need to be made that, if they're all made together, will quite radically transform people's levels of vulnerability or improve their resilience to heat events. So just ensuring that people have the ability to safely access public facilities like toilets, whether that's a social intervention where it's ensuring that there are people who can go with them and keep them safe, or having a sort of organization of women who can go out together at various points in the day, or providing security of some kind, or building more toilet facilities. I mean, none of these things are technically complicated. Yes, of course, everything has a cost associated with it. But none of these are pushing the envelope in terms of the sort of technical understanding of how we might adapt. The same with shelter of homes. I mean, even if we couldn't retrofit every auto-constructed home in an off-grid settlement, we can provide communal shelters that for perhaps gender-segregated groups, where at least there is a shelter for a particular area. The other thing I wanted to add was that there are a lot of interventions that have co-benefits for other kinds of hazards, and for the health of the population in general. So ensuring ready access to good drinking water and enough water to clean and bathe your house with has a whole raft of implications just for general health and well-being that go far beyond heat, whether that's avoiding waterborne diseases or just improving quality of life and hygiene in the home. I mean, these are all things that every household wants, every government wants. And so most of the interventions that we have for heat are things that we should be doing anyway, for the general quality of life of the populace. There's very few heat interventions that are only specifically for heat. Most of them have co-benefits for other hazards and other outcomes that are desirable.
Yeah, and I think that is something that needs to be repeatedly emphasized, especially in pushing for policy interventions for heat. Because the thing with climate change is there can be a tendency of hopelessness attached to it when it comes to solutions. And to be able to suggest that such interventions are not only possible, but are also not challenging in the ways that one would assume for them to be challenging. Of course, that is not to say that there is nothing in the way of these implementations being put in place, but to gauge a sense of practicality in heat management is essentially the point where the conversation must begin. I also do want to mention our work as part of Cool Infrastructures. I think there's a huge element of novelty with this project in the way that it opens up the domain of heat and the various avenues that it uses to explore it, especially in terms of the methodologies and technologies that are used interdisciplinarily within this project. Considering that, I think it is important to discuss what these methodologies are, how they're effectively helping us understand heat in the city, and the sort of data that they can give to us to really break down heat both qualitatively and quantitatively. And of course, there are limitations as well. And I suppose that feeds into the bigger question of how are these new technologies and new methodologies changing the landscape of how climate change in the urban is conceptualized?
I think one of the really interesting things about the Cool Infrastructures project is that it brings together so many disciplines. And that is not simply an exercise of academic curiosity. It's really been very notable in the ways in which heat has been managed at a governmental level over the last decades, that there is a very significant degree of siloization or bifurcation of effort and understanding between different disciplines. So there's very strong there's a lot of knowledge, for example, in the meteorology sector about, how we should project these forecasts, but what those actually mean and whether those conditions are dangerous or not for human health is not always known. There's a lot of research in the health sciences about what is important for the human body, but whether those conditions are met in the environment isn't always communicated with the meteorologists, and whether we can actually implement the measures that are needed to ensure that people aren't vulnerable or aren't exposed to heat is also not necessarily dealt with very well in relation to people's living conditions or the kinds of accommodation that they have or city planning. So there's an awful amount of expertise that just doesn't speak to each other across these different academic and policy domains, which is, I think, why Cool Infrastructures is so crucial. Because I would say, as far as I'm aware, it's one of the most expansive in its sort of disciplinary scope in bringing all of these subject knowledges and policy arenas together. Methodologically, I think it's fascinating. The project has drawn on all of the methods that are kind of, how would I say this? The project has drawn on all of the methods that are really germane to each of these different disciplines and brought these huge amounts of expertise together in really novel ways. Whether that's using thermal imaging in conjunction with video ethnography, or the amazing work that KUL is doing with architectural models that harness data on the locations of buildings, their orientation in relation to the movement of the sun, and using that to provide a sort of thermal temporal model against which we can much better understand why building occupants behave in the way they do, why they use spaces in the way they do, why they build entire buildings the way they do in relation to these thermal flows across space and time. So I think there's some really novel uses of contemporary technology that are actually helping us to much better communicate and understand these shifts, which we're certainly making use of in Cool Infrastructures.
So trying to wrap up everything we have spoken about so far, and considering how heat can be a very anxiety-led subject to engage with for a lot of people, I think it would be very helpful to end this by outlining from a researcher's and an academic perspective what we know of heat and what we don't, especially in terms of how our futures look with heat in the city.
I think one of the things to be really clear about is that there is absolutely zero uncertainty that heat waves and extreme heat, but heat waves in particular, will get hotter, that they will last longer, that they will occur more frequently, that they will start earlier in the season. There's also zero uncertainty that it's getting hotter. Exactly how quickly that is going to unfold is the subject of some debate, but we know that the IPCC recent assessment report AR6, they have very strong confidence that the planet is heating up. I mean, obviously that's going to play out slightly differently and slightly in different places. And we don't know, for example, depending on emissions, whether that's going to be 2 degrees of warming or 6 degrees of warming. But in a sense, that doesn't matter because we are already unprepared now for the 1 degree of warming that we already have. So what we absolutely do know is we have to act. We have to act now. And if we can't cope with 1 degree, we are going to be woefully unprepared for 2 degrees. And clearly, if we have 6 degrees of warming, it's going to be catastrophic. So we absolutely have to get moving on this issue now. It's probably one of the most critical globally. So in that sense, we have completely sufficient projections of climate change to start acting, to start adapting. Where we have a little bit more of an issue, I think, in relation to our ability to forecast heat is at the shorter timescales. So whether that's short-term forecasts, such as weather forecasts for the days ahead or seasonal forecasts, there is, I think, for the meteorological sciences, some work to do there. Not necessarily in the science itself, but in the sense of being able to provide data, information, and forecasting skills to all of the places that need them. Where we see this a lot is, or being an issue, is in a lot of tropical regions that are also lower to middle income countries. With sub-Saharan Africa, I think particularly poorly served in this department, needing a lot of support to make sure that they actually have the data and information and skill to provide these forecasts so that they can be acted on and populations can be prepared. One final thing I would say is absolutely critical is that because a lot of the work on heat, extreme heat, has come out of Europe or out of North America, where humidity isn't such a fundamental issue, is that we have woefully neglected humidity in how we talk about heat. So oftentimes we talk about extreme temperatures and we just assume that extreme heat is synonymous with extreme temperature, but it's not. For the human body, it's really critical that we also include an understanding of how humidity can make moderately warm temperatures much more damaging to our ability to survive them. So we absolutely have to include humidity in our forecasts at the very least in order to properly project the risk that will be, to properly project the risk that will unfold from particular conditions, and therefore to properly ascertain where we most need to focus our resources. Because if we don't do that, we're going to misinterpret the level of risk and apply our resources inefficiently or even worse, ineffectively, meaning that we focus our resources in one location, but actually people in another location are more at risk and suffering.
Well, thank you so much, Elspeth, for taking out time to have this conversation with me. It certainly gave me lots to think about, and I hope it does the same for anyone tuning in. If you would like to learn more about Karachi Urban Lab or the Cool Infrastructures Project, please visit us on our websites, www.karachiurbanlab.com and www.coolinfrastructures.com. Thank you for joining me. Goodbye.